Angela Carter stood at the gate, her gaze resting on the planes that moved with deliberate precision against the backdrop of a pale morning sky. For a moment, she allowed herself the luxury of stillness, something her life rarely afforded. The airport hummed, footsteps, announcements. The low murmur of conversation felt oddly soothing, like background music in a life that had been anything but quiet. She adjusted the strap of her carry-on bag, its worn leather bearing the weight of countless journeys, many professional, few personal. This trip to Washington, D.C., was meant to be a break, or as close to one as her position allowed. Another conference, another panel discussion, this time on the evolving complexities of constitutional law. The irony wasn't lost on her that this so-called break would still involve standing in front of a room, answering questions, debating nuances, but at least it was a break from deciding the fate of others, a task that had defined her for years. Angela glanced at her reflection in the terminal window. Her navy blazer was neat, her cream blouse unwrinkled, her silver hair pinned back in a style her daughter, Maya, often teased as too judicial. Without her robes, she looked like any other business traveler. Perhaps that was why she savored these moments, blending in, invisible among the swarm of people rushing to their gates. As the boarding call echoed across the terminal, Angela joined the line for first class. She noted the casual elegance of the passengers around her tailored suits, designer bags, quiet confidence. She knew this crowd well, having shared spaces with them for decades. Yet, even now, there were moments when she felt like an intruder in their world. A man ahead of her argued into his phone about quarterly earnings, his voice carrying despite his attempt at discretion. Behind her, a young woman wrestled with an oversized backpack. The world, Angela thought, was full of such small, unremarkable dramas. It was only when people peeled back the layers that the real stories emerged, stories that often had nothing to do with market shares or mismatched luggage. The flight attendant smiled as Angela handed over her boarding pass, her expression neutral but polite. Angela noted the flicker of hesitation, the brief pause that spoke volumes to someone who had spent years parsing subtle shifts in tone and body language. The attendant recovered quickly, directing Angela down the jet bridge with a practiced gesture. Angela moved on without comment. There was no point in dwelling on it. Her seat, 2A, was precisely where she'd asked to be, by the window, where she could watch the clouds drift past and let her thoughts wander. She stowed her bag in the overhead compartment, the motions automatic, practiced. The cabin filled around her with the soft shuffle of passengers finding their places, settling into the relative comfort of first class. Angela caught snippets of conversation, muted discussions about business trips, vacation plans, family updates. She eased into her seat, the leather firm but welcoming. The flight attendant returned, offering a choice of pre-flight beverages. Water, please, Angela said with a small smile, knowing hydration was a necessity for the long day ahead. As she sipped her water, she glanced briefly at the woman seated next to her, dressed in a sharp pantsuit. The woman gave Angela a polite nod before returning to the magazine in her lap. Angela appreciated the quiet. She wasn't in the mood for small talk, nor did she expect it. Over the years, she had grown accustomed to the reserved demeanor of those who shared these cabins with her. The engines hummed to life, and Angela felt the familiar push of anticipation as the plane began to taxi. Her father's words surfaced in her mind, as they often did at moments like this. It's a marvel, baby girl, how something so heavy can rise above it all. He had been talking about planes, of course, but the sentiment had always felt larger, more profound. As the ground fell away beneath her, Angela looked out the window, watching the city shrink into a patchwork of streets and rooftops. Up here, everything seemed simpler, less fraught. It was a perspective she valued, though she knew it was fleeting. Once the plane landed, the world's complexities would press in again, as they always did. For now, she allowed herself a moment of peace. Angela closed her eyes, feeling the subtle vibrations of the plane as it climbed. She didn't know, of course, that this fleeting sense of calm would soon be disrupted. Yet, deep down, she understood that peace, for someone like her, was often a temporary state, something to be cherished but never taken for granted. The real world, with all its quiet tensions and unspoken assumptions, had a way of finding her. Even at 30,000 feet. Angela had just opened her book. A historical novel she'd been meaning to finish for months. When a shadow fell across her seat. The presence lingered, heavy and insistent, interrupting her thoughts. She glanced up, her gaze meeting a man in his mid-40s. He was immaculately dressed, his suit perfectly pressed, his expression taut with a mixture of confusion and entitlement. "Excuse me," he said, his voice polite on the surface but edged with something harder. "I believe you might be in the wrong seat." Angela let his words settle in the air for a moment, measuring their weight. She had heard variations of this before, in different settings and circumstances. The words were rarely about the seat itself, they carried with them a deeper insinuation. One she had learned to recognize long ago. She closed her book gently, marking her place with the ribbon sewn into its spine. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she replied, her tone even, devoid of any edge. It was the voice she used in courtrooms when addressing overzealous attorneys firm. Measured and unyielding. The man hesitated, glancing at the seat number etched in bronze beside her shoulder. He didn't seem convinced. His gaze flicked over her blazer and blouse. Her silver hair pinned back with understated elegance. "These are first-class seats," he said, as though explaining something obvious to a child. "Maybe there was some mix-up during boarding?" Angela took a slow breath, summoning the patience she had cultivated over decades. "There's no mix-up," she said, reaching into the side pocket of her bag to retrieve her boarding pass. "But if it will put your mind at ease, you're welcome to double-check." The man took the slip of paper but didn't look at it. Instead, he turned to the flight attendant who had been watching the interaction from a few feet away. The young woman Sarah, her name tag read, stepped forward, her professional smile faltering ever so slightly. "Ma'am," Sarah began, her voice tinged with the same hesitant doubt Angela had encountered countless times before. "May I see your ticket? Just to confirm?" Angela handed over the pass, her movements deliberate and calm. "Of course," she said, though she didn't need to. The small burn of frustration that flickered in her chest was a familiar one. But it stayed contained. This was not a new experience. Nor was it unexpected. It was just another iteration of the same old dance. The flight attendant examined the ticket carefully. More carefully than she likely had any of the others. Angela could see it in the furrow of her brow. The way she tilted the paper under the light. As though the truth might be hidden in some invisible ink. Finally, she straightened, her cheeks faintly pink. "This is indeed your seat," Sarah said, her voice almost apologetic. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience." But the man wasn't finished. He shifted his weight from one polished shoe to the other, his uncertainty replaced by defensiveness. "It's just that, well, these seats are expensive. I thought there might have been a mistake." Angela looked at him, her expression unreadable. "The mistake," she said, her voice still steady, "was assuming I didn't belong here." Her words were quiet but carried enough weight to still the air around them. Nearby passengers, who had been pretending not to listen, now looked up from their phones and magazines. Some exchanged glances. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The cabin seemed smaller somehow. The walls closer. The space between rows narrower. The man's face reddened slightly, though whether from embarrassment or indignation, Angela couldn't tell. "I didn't mean," he began. But the words stumbled and fell apart. "You didn't mean to make assumptions?" Angela asked, not unkindly but with a precision honed by years of careful questioning. She could feel the eyes of the cabin on her now. A mix of curiosity, discomfort, and quiet support. "Or you didn't mean for those assumptions to be noticed?" The flight attendant cleared her throat, stepping back into the role of mediator. "Sir," she said gently, "we really do need to prepare for takeoff. If you could please take your seat." The man hesitated for a moment longer before mumbling something that might have been an apology. He handed Angela's ticket back to Sarah, turned, and moved down the aisle to his assigned seat. The tension in the air didn't dissipate immediately. It lingered like the hum of the engines. Faint but undeniable. Angela picked up her book again, though she didn't open it. Her thoughts were too restless now. Circling back to the exchange. It wasn't the first time her presence in certain spaces had been questioned. And she knew it wouldn't be the last. She thought of her daughter, Maya, who had faced similar moments in her own way and who often asked, "Does it ever get easier?" The answer, Angela knew, was both yes and no. The sting of these moments dulled with time. But the weight of them never fully disappeared. They settled in layers, one on top of the other, like sediment at the bottom of a riverbed. Across the aisle, a woman leaned over slightly, her magazine forgotten. "I'm sorry," she said in a low voice. "That shouldn't have happened." Angela met her gaze and offered a small smile. "Thank you," she replied. It was a simple acknowledgement. Nothing more, but it carried with it a quiet grace. The seatbelt sign dinged on, and the cabin prepared for takeoff. Angela closed her eyes briefly, listening to the low murmur of engines and the faint rustle of passengers settling in. She thought about her father's words again, about heavy things rising above. The plane began to ascend, the ground falling away beneath them. Up here, Angela thought, everything looked smaller: problems, people, and the assumptions they carried. But even at 30,000 feet, some things were impossible to leave behind. The plane leveled off, the seatbelt sign chimed off, and the passengers began to settle into the rhythms of a long flight. Angela turned her attention back to her book, determined to lose herself in its pages. But her mind was restless, circling back to the confrontation, the quiet tension that still lingered in the air. She could feel the occasional glance in her direction, fleeting but noticeable. She wasn't new to this. Years of navigating rooms where she wasn't expected, classrooms, boardrooms, courtrooms had taught her to sense the unspoken questions before they were voiced. Who is she? How did she get here? Does she belong? In the seat across the aisle, the man from earlier, Mitchell, she'd heard someone call him, sat stiffly, staring at the screen of his laptop. He hadn't so much as looked her way since the flight attendant had confirmed her ticket. Angela imagined him replaying the encounter in his mind, perhaps wondering how it had spiraled into something larger than he intended. The aisle seat next to her belonged to Carla, a polished woman in her 50s who had introduced herself earlier with a brief but friendly nod. Carla had spent much of the flight pretending to read a magazine, though Angela could tell her attention was elsewhere. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and careful. "I couldn't help but notice earlier, that man. Some people just don't think before they speak." Angela looked up, closing her book softly. She considered her words, her tone. "It's not always about speaking," she replied. "Sometimes it's about what's already thought, long before anything is said." Carla nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "I suppose you're right. It's just, I don't understand how someone could behave like that in this day and age." Angela offered a faint smile, though there was little humor in it. "Bias doesn't check the calendar," she said simply. "It's as persistent as gravity. You don't always notice it, but it's always there." Carla seemed to absorb this, her brow furrowing slightly. She hesitated, as though weighing whether to continue. "If you don't mind me asking," she said, her voice soft, "how do you handle moments like that? Do you ever get tired of it?" The question was honest, without judgment, and Angela appreciated that. She leaned back in her seat, looking out at the endless expanse of clouds beyond the window. "I've had to learn which battles to fight," she said, "and which ones to let go. It's not about avoiding confrontation, it's about knowing when speaking up can lead to something constructive." Carla nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. She didn't respond, but Angela could sense that the conversation had stirred something in her. Perhaps memories, perhaps realizations. Angela had seen it before, the quiet processing, the slow unraveling of assumptions people hadn't even realized they held. A flight attendant approached, her presence breaking the silence. It was Sarah, the young woman who had earlier examined Angela's ticket with such scrutiny. Her demeanor was different now, less guarded, more uncertain. "Judge Carter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to apologize for earlier. I should have handled that differently." Angela looked up at her, noting the genuine discomfort in her expression. "Thank you," she said, "but it's not about me. What matters is how you handle the next situation. And the one after that." Sarah nodded quickly, her hands clasped in front of her. I'll remember that, she said before retreating down the aisle. Angela turned back to her book. But Carla spoke again, her voice even quieter this time. Judge Carter? Are you on the Supreme Court? Angela's gaze shifted to her, noting the mix of awe and curiosity in Carla's expression. It wasn't the first time someone had recognized her, not that she sought recognition. Yes, she said simply. She left it at that. Unwilling to elaborate, the title carried weight, and it always changed the tone of the conversation. Carla leaned back in her seat, silent for a moment before speaking again. I thought I recognized you. My daughter's a lawyer. She mentioned hearing you speak once, said it was one of the most inspiring moments of her career. Angela offered a polite smile. I'm glad to hear that. But the conversation wasn't over. Carla tilted her head, studying Angela with a thoughtful expression. It's strange, isn't it, that someone like you, someone who's accomplished so much, still has to deal with what happened earlier. Angela closed her book again, resting it on her lap. It's not strange, she said evenly. It's the reality for many of us. Accomplishments don't erase assumptions, they just make them more glaring when they surface. Carla's face softened, a hint of sadness creeping into her expression. I hadn't thought of it that way. Angela glanced toward Mitchell, who was now typing furiously on his laptop. I'm used to being questioned, she said, her voice steady, but what I'm not used to is silence. Moments like these are opportunities. Not just for me, but for everyone who witnesses them. Carla nodded, her gaze distant now, as though replaying the earlier scene in her mind. The cabin had grown quieter, the hum of the engines the only constant sound. Around them, passengers were absorbed in their own worlds. But Angela could feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The confrontation had left an imprint, one that lingered like the faint trail of a jet across the sky. Angela returned to her book, but the words blurred on the page. The earlier exchange wasn't finished. Not truly. It had opened a door, and the question now was whether anyone would have the courage to walk through it. The cabin had settled into a rhythm of quiet. Passengers reclined in their seats, headphones on, books open, or eyes closed as they tried to pass the time. The earlier confrontation had faded into the background for most, but Angela could feel its subtle undercurrent lingering, like a river flowing just beneath the surface. These moments were never truly forgotten, they simply reshaped themselves, settling into the quiet thoughts of those who had witnessed them. Angela herself felt the weight of it, not because of Mitchell's challenge. She had long grown accustomed to such moments, but because of the ripples it left in its wake. It was like tossing a stone into a still pond. The initial splash might be small, but the ripples touched everything in their path, distorting the surface in ways that were often hard to predict. She glanced across the aisle. Mitchell was still typing, his posture tense. Occasionally, his fingers would hover over the keys, as if the words he wanted to write wouldn't come. She didn't know what was on his screen, but something in his body language suggested reflection. Whether it was about her or something else, she couldn't say. From the corner of her eye, Angela noticed Sarah, the flight attendant, lingering near the galley. Her gaze flitted nervously toward Angela's row, and when their eyes met, Sarah hesitated before approaching. Judge Carter, she began, her voice quieter than before. I wanted to thank you for what you said earlier, about handling the next situation differently. Angela closed her book, giving Sarah her full attention. You're welcome, she said evenly. It's a lesson we all need to remind ourselves of, myself included. Sarah nodded, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. It's just, I didn't even realize what I was doing. Not really, but when you said it wasn't about you, it made me think about how often I might make those assumptions without noticing. Angela regarded her for a moment, noting the sincerity in her expression. Awareness is the first step, she said. The hard part is what comes next, choosing to act differently, even when it's uncomfortable. Sarah smiled faintly, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Thank you, she said again before retreating to her duties. Angela turned back to her book, but she had barely read a page when Carla leaned over. I've been thinking, Carla said, her tone hesitant but firm, about what you said earlier, about accomplishments not erasing assumptions. Angela glanced at her, closing the book once more. What about it? Carla folded her hands in her lap. Her gaze distant. I think it's true. And it's not just about race. Is it? It's about anything that makes someone stand out: age, gender, even something as simple as an accent. People see what they expect to see. Angela nodded, her expression thoughtful. Expectations shape perception, and perception shapes behavior. Carla tilted her head, her brow furrowed in thought. But how do we change that? How do we shift those expectations when they're so deeply ingrained? Angela let the question hang in the air for a moment before responding. One moment at a time. She said, it's not about grand gestures or sweeping changes. It's about small decisions, challenging an assumption, questioning a bias, speaking up when it's easier to stay silent. Carla seemed to consider this, her lips pressing into a thin line. I wish I'd spoken up earlier, she admitted, her voice barely audible. When that man questioned you, I just sat here, watching. Angela's gaze softened. Speaking up isn't easy, she said, especially in the moment, but recognizing that hesitation is important. It's where change starts. Carla nodded, though her expression remained troubled. Angela could see the ripple in her, a seed of awareness planted, taking root in ways neither of them could yet predict. From a few rows back, a voice broke through the quiet hum of the cabin. Judge Carter? It was Mitchell. He stood awkwardly in the aisle, clutching his laptop like a shield. Do you mind if we could talk? Angela motioned to the empty seat across the aisle, and he sank into it, his movements stiff and uncertain. For a moment, he didn't speak, his gaze fixed on his hands. Then, with a deep breath, he began. I've been thinking about what happened earlier, he said, his voice low but steady. And I realized, I've probably done that before. Made assumptions, maybe not as openly, but still. Angela listened, her expression unreadable. I have 3 daughters, Mitchell continued, his words gaining momentum. I tell them all the time that they can do anything. Be anything. But if I'm being honest, I don't know if I've really shown them what that means. Not if I act the way I did earlier. Angela leaned forward slightly, her voice calm. Recognition is the first step, she said. What matters now is what you do with it. Mitchell nodded, his shoulders relaxing a fraction. I want to do better, he said. For them, for myself. I'm just not sure where to start. Angela considered him for a moment, her gaze steady. Start small, she said. Pay attention to the moments that make you uncomfortable. Ask yourself why, and don't shy away from the answers, even when they're difficult. Mitchell nodded again, his grip on the laptop loosening. Thank you, he said simply before returning to his seat. As the plane hummed steadily through the clouds, Angela felt a shift in the cabin. It wasn't dramatic, no loud declarations or sudden transformations. It was quieter than that. A subtle ripple of awareness moving through the space. Passengers who had pretended not to notice the earlier confrontation now seemed to carry themselves differently, more thoughtful, more aware. Angela opened her book once more, but she didn't mind the interruptions. These moments, as quiet and fleeting as they seemed, were where real change began. The cabin was quiet now, the ambient noise of the engines a constant backdrop. Yet, within the stillness, something had shifted. Angela could feel it, a subtle energy, a quiet unraveling of the assumptions that had hovered and spoken between passengers since the flight began. It wasn't dramatic, nor was it overt. It was a slow, careful peeling away of layers. Carla leaned back in her seat, her magazine long forgotten on the tray table. You know, she said, her voice low as though not wanting to disturb the fragile stillness. My daughter talks about this kind of thing all the time. She's in corporate law, and she's always pointing out how people are treated differently based on the smallest details. Angela turned her head slightly, inviting Carla to continue. She says it's not even the big, obvious things most of the time. Carla went on, her brow furrowed in thought. It's the small things, the way someone hesitates before responding, or the tone they use when they do, the way they question some people more than others without realizing why. Angela nodded, her expression thoughtful. It's often the small things that carry the most weight, she said, because they're harder to notice, harder to call out, and because they happen so often, they pile up over time. Carla pressed her lips together, her gaze distant. I always thought of myself as someone who doesn't see color. You know, someone who treats everyone the same. But after watching what happened earlier, I'm starting to wonder if that's really true. Angela didn't respond immediately. She let Carla's words settle between them like the faint hum of the engines. Seeing color isn't the problem, Angela said finally. Pretending not to see it is. Because when you ignore it, you ignore the experiences that come with it, the struggles, the biases, the history. Carla nodded slowly, her expression pensive. I hadn't thought of it that way, she admitted. From a row behind them, a man's voice broke the quiet. If I may, he said, leaning forward slightly, I think a lot of us don't realize how much we carry with us until moments like this force us to stop and think. Angela turned toward him. He was older, perhaps in his 70s, with a kind face and an air of quiet thoughtfulness. I was a teacher for 30 years. He continued, his voice calm and measured. And I'd like to think I treated all my students the same. But now I wonder, did I hold some of them to higher standards than others? Did I expect less from certain kids because of where they came from? His words hung in the air, resonating in the quiet cabin. Angela could see the ripple of acknowledgement in the faces of the nearby passengers. It was a familiar ripple, the quiet reckoning of recognizing one's own biases. I think the important thing, Angela said, her tone gentle, is that you're asking those questions now. Awareness isn't something we arrive at all at once. It's a journey, one that requires us to keep learning, keep questioning. The man nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. I suppose it's never too late to learn. A few seats away, a younger man in his 30s leaned into the conversation. His tie was loosened, and his laptop lay forgotten on his tray table. It's like debugging code, he said, his tone sheepish but sincere. You have to look for the errors you didn't even know were there. And once you find them, you can't just ignore them, you have to fix them. Angela allowed herself a small smile. That's an apt analogy, she said. Bias is like a glitch in our programming. It's not always intentional, but if we don't address it, it affects everything we do. The young man nodded eagerly, encouraged by her response. Around them, the conversation began to shift, expand. Passengers who had been silent until now started to chime in, sharing their own thoughts, their own reflections. An older woman with silver hair and a sharp blazer leaned across the aisle. I've been in business for 40 years, she said, and even now, I still get mistaken for someone's secretary when I walk into a meeting. It's infuriating, but I've learned to let it roll off my back. You have to, don't you? Angela tilted her head, considering her words. Letting it roll off your back might work in the moment, she said, but over time, it adds up. Sometimes, we have to choose to address it not for ourselves, but for the people who come after us. The woman nodded, her expression softening. You're right, she said. I have a granddaughter starting college next year. I'd hate for her to face the same things I did. The conversation continued, weaving its way through the cabin like an invisible thread. Passengers who had started the flight as strangers now spoke with a surprising intimacy, their shared experiences forming a quiet bond. Angela listened, offering her thoughts when asked but letting the conversation flow naturally. She knew these moments wouldn't solve the larger issues not on their own. But they mattered. They planted seeds, sparked questions, created ripples, and ripples, she knew, could grow into waves. The plane hit a patch of turbulence. The cabin shuddering briefly, passengers instinctively gripped their armrests, their conversations pausing for a moment. When the turbulence passed, Angela glanced out the window at the clouds below. Funny, isn't it? Carla said, breaking the silence. How something as simple as a conversation can feel so profound. Angela turned back to her, her expression thoughtful. The most important conversations often are, she said, because they force us to see things we've been avoiding or didn't even realize we were avoiding. Carla nodded, her gaze thoughtful. Around them, the cabin began to quiet again as passengers returned to their books, their screens, their thoughts. But Angela could feel the change in the air, the subtle shift in how people carried themselves, how they looked at one another. It wasn't dramatic, nor was it sudden, but it was there, a ripple, small but steady, moving outward. As the plane began its descent, The shifting pressure seemed to mirror the quiet transformation within the cabin. The earlier tension, like the clouds outside, had begun to dissipate. Angela noticed the subtle changes not just in the atmosphere but in the faces around her. People carried themselves differently, their expressions softened by reflection. She closed her book again, knowing she wouldn't finish it this flight. Moments like this demanded attention. Even if they weren't loud or dramatic, they were quiet, like seeds taking root in fertile soil, their growth invisible but inevitable. Across the aisle, Mitchell fidgeted in his seat. He had been silent since their earlier exchange. His laptop now closed and forgotten. Angela caught his eye, and he hesitated before speaking. "Judge Carter," he said, his voice careful, as though afraid of misstepping again. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier about assumptions." Angela turned to him, her expression patient but expectant. He cleared his throat, glancing briefly at the passengers around him. "I've realized something," he continued. "I tell my daughters they can be anything they want. But I wonder if I've shown them what that really means. Or if I've just reinforced the same old ideas without realizing it." His admission was quiet, almost hesitant, but it carried the weight of genuine reflection. Angela offered a small nod. "The hardest part of parenting," she said, "is recognizing the gap between what we teach and what we model. Awareness is the first step." Mitchell nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "It's uncomfortable," he admitted, "thinking about how many times I might have made someone feel less than." Without even realizing it, Angela leaned forward slightly, her tone steady but kind. "It is uncomfortable," she agreed, "but that discomfort is necessary. It's what pushes us to change. The question isn't whether we've made mistakes, it's what we choose to do once we've recognized them." Mitchell seemed to absorb her words, his gaze distant as he turned them over in his mind. He wasn't the only one reflecting. Carla, seated beside Angela, had been silent for much of the descent. But now she leaned closer. "You know," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "I've been thinking about my daughter. She's so outspoken about these things: bias, equity, inclusion. Sometimes I've thought she was too sensitive. But now I wonder if I've just been too complacent." Angela tilted her head slightly. "Complacency often feels easier," she said, "but it comes at a cost. The world doesn't change by itself. It changes because people like your daughter refuse to settle for what's easy." Carla nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I'll have to tell her about this flight," she said. "I think she'd be proud to know it made me think differently." Behind them, a voice spoke up, hesitant but clear. "I'm a teacher," said the man who had spoken earlier about his students. "I've been thinking about how I grade papers. Whether I've let my expectations, my biases affect how I evaluate my students' work." Angela turned to face him, her expression thoughtful, acknowledging that possibility is important. She said, "But don't stop there. Look for patterns. Challenge yourself to see beyond them." The man nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I'll do that," he said, "for their sake, and mine." The cabin was filled with a quiet hum of conversation now. Passengers exchanging thoughts and reflections. It was rare, Angela knew, for such openness to emerge in a space like this, a plane, where people typically avoided eye contact and focused on their own worlds. But something had shifted. The earlier confrontation had cracked something open, and now the light was spilling in. The plane hit a small patch of turbulence, the cabin shuddering briefly. Angela felt the subtle tightening of muscles around her. Passengers instinctively gripping armrests or steadying their drinks. The moment passed, but it left behind a heightened awareness, a reminder of the fragility of their journey. Both literal and metaphorical. Carla spoke again, her tone reflective. "You know," she said, "I came on this flight thinking about a big presentation I have tomorrow. I've been worried about getting everything just right, about making the best impression. But now, that feels small. Somehow. Like I've been focusing on the wrong things." Angela regarded her with quiet curiosity. "What do you mean?" Carla hesitated, then gestured vaguely toward the cabin. "This," she said, "these conversations, these realizations, they feel more important than any presentation ever could." Angela smiled faintly. "Sometimes," she said, It takes stepping outside of our usual focus to see what really matters. The seatbelt sign chimed on, signaling their final approach. Around them, passengers began tidying their spaces, closing laptops, returning books to bags. But the conversations didn't stop. Angela could hear snippets of them, a woman discussing hiring practices with her colleague, a young man talking about algorithmic bias, an older couple reflecting on their own experiences of being overlooked or underestimated. As the plane descended through the clouds, Angela looked out the window at the city below. The streets and buildings came into view, small and orderly from this height. From here, the world seemed manageable, its problems distant and abstract. But Angela knew better. The real work was on the ground, in the messy, complicated lives of people trying to navigate a world filled with unspoken assumptions and invisible barriers. When the wheels touched down, there was a moment of stillness as the cabin absorbed the jolt of landing. Angela felt it too, a grounding, a reminder that their shared journey was nearing its end. But as she gathered her things, she couldn't help but feel that something had begun here. Something small but significant. The plane slowed, its engines humming softly as it taxied toward the gate. Angela glanced around the cabin, taking in the faces of the passengers she had shared this journey with. She didn't know where their reflections would lead them, what changes, if any, they would make in their lives. But she believed in the power of ripples. And sometimes, that was enough. The plane had come to a stop at the gate, its engines quieting into stillness. Passengers began the familiar ritual of gathering their belongings, stretching stiff limbs, and checking their phones for messages they had missed during the flight. Yet the usual rush to disembark was absent. The air in the cabin felt different, as though something unspoken had tethered the passengers to their seats for just a moment longer. Angela remained in her place, her carry-on still tucked neatly beneath the seat in front of her. She watched as Mitchell, seated a few rows back, stood awkwardly in the aisle, his laptop clutched under one arm. He hesitated, then turned toward her. "Judge Carter," he said, his voice low but steady. "May I have a word before we go?" Angela nodded, gesturing for him to approach. He made his way toward her with a tentative air, like a man navigating unfamiliar terrain. When he reached her row, he stood there for a moment, his gaze shifting between her and the floor. "I wanted to thank you," he began, his words slow and deliberate. "Not just for your patience earlier, but for everything you said afterward." Angela inclined her head slightly, waiting for him to continue. "I've been thinking about it the whole flight," Mitchell admitted, "about how quick I was to judge, and how often I probably do it without even realizing. I never stopped to question it before." He glanced toward the cabin, where other passengers were watching with quiet curiosity. "But now, I think I will." Angela studied him for a moment, her expression calm but thoughtful. "Recognition is the first step," she said. "The real challenge is what comes next, what you choose to do with that awareness." Mitchell nodded, his grip tightening on his laptop. "I want to do better," he said. "For my daughters, for myself." He hesitated, then added, "For people like you, who shouldn't have to deal with what happened earlier." Angela gave him a small, measured smile. "Start with the people around you," she said. "Change begins in the smallest circles." As Mitchell returned to his seat, Angela turned her attention back to the aisle. Carla was standing now, her carry-on slung over one shoulder. She paused beside Angela's row, her expression a mixture of gratitude and determination. "I wanted to say thank you too," Carla said, "for what you said earlier about awareness. It's made me think differently, not just about how I see others, but how I see myself." Angela nodded. "Self-reflection is a powerful tool," she said, "but it's only the beginning. What matters is how it shapes your actions." Carla smiled faintly, a flicker of resolve in her eyes. "I'll remember that." Around them, other passengers were beginning to move, their earlier conversations lingering in the air like an aftertaste. Angela could hear snippets, people sharing stories, exchanging ideas, grappling with questions they hadn't considered before. It was a quiet hum of introspection, subtle yet profound. As Angela reached for her bag, Sarah, the flight attendant, appeared beside her, her expression earnest. "Judge Carter," she said, her voice just above a whisper. I wanted to thank you too. For your grace earlier, and for what you said about acting differently next time. It's given me a lot to think about. Angela met her gaze, noting the genuine sincerity there. Thinking is important, she said, but remember change happens in the doing. Sarah nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips. I'll keep that in mind. As the last passengers began filing out of the cabin, Angela stood, pulling her carry-on from beneath the seat. She moved with the same deliberate calm she carried in the courtroom. Her steps steady and unhurried. At the front of the cabin, she paused, glancing back at the rows of seats behind her. The conversations had quieted, but their echoes lingered, a reminder of the ripples that had started here. At 30,000 feet. In the terminal, the fluorescent lights cast long shadows on the floor, and the steady murmur of travelers filled the air. Angela watched as Mitchell disappeared into the crowd, his stride more purposeful than it had been when he boarded. Carla stood near the coffee kiosk, typing something into her phone with a look of quiet determination. Sarah was speaking with another flight attendant, her gestures animated, her expression thoughtful. Angela's phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from her daughter. Maya, how was the flight? It read. Angela smiled faintly, typing back a quick response. Eventful. I'll tell you about it later. As she made her way through the terminal, Angela couldn't help but reflect on the flight, not just the confrontation, but what had followed. It wasn't often that a moment of discomfort led to something constructive, something meaningful, but this time, it had. And while the changes sparked here might be small, Angela knew they had the potential to grow. Because that was how change worked. Not in sweeping gestures or dramatic moments, but in quiet conversations and subtle shifts in the choices people made when they thought no one was watching. And sometimes, those ripples began in the most unexpected places. Even at 30,000 feet, the conference room was alive with muted energy. Attendees, lawyers, scholars, judges murmured amongst themselves, their name tags swaying as they moved. The crowd was diverse in some ways, familiar in others, each person carrying the weight of their profession's expectations. Angela Carter stood behind the podium, reviewing her notes one last time. The original speech she had prepared, a detailed analysis of modern constitutional challenges, now felt inadequate. The events of the flight had shifted her perspective. She had realized that the issues she planned to discuss weren't confined to legal texts or courtrooms. They lived in everyday interactions, in the subtle, often unseen currents that shaped people's lives. The room quieted as the moderator introduced her, listing her accomplishments in a tone of practiced reverence. Angela stepped forward, her movements deliberate, her gaze sweeping the audience. She placed her notes down but didn't glance at them. Instead, she began speaking directly, her voice steady and measured. I had a different speech prepared for today, she said, but yesterday, at 30,000 feet, I witnessed something that made me rethink what I wanted to share with you. The audience leaned in slightly, their interest peaked. During the flight, Angela continued, a moment of discomfort sparked a conversation, one that forced everyone involved, including myself, to confront their assumptions. It wasn't a dramatic moment, nor was it particularly unique, but it was powerful in its quiet way because it revealed something we don't often like to admit, that bias, both implicit and explicit, exists everywhere. She paused, letting her words settle. As judges, attorneys, and legal scholars, we like to think of ourselves as objective, guided by facts and evidence, she said, but even in our hallowed institutions, assumptions creep in. They shape how we see cases, how we evaluate arguments, how we interpret laws, and those assumptions, whether rooted in race, gender, socioeconomic status, or something else, don't simply appear in courtrooms. They begin in the smallest interactions, often unnoticed, often unchallenged. The room was silent now, the murmurs of before replaced by thoughtful stillness. I realized yesterday, Angela said, that justice doesn't begin in the courtroom. It begins in these moments, in the quiet, everyday choices we make about how we treat one another. It begins when we decide to question our assumptions, to recognize our biases, and to choose differently. She paused again, her gaze scanning the audience. She saw Mitchell in the back, sitting straighter than he had on the plane. His expression attentive. She saw Carla, nodding subtly, a faint smile of encouragement on her lips. During that flight, passengers from different walks of life began sharing their stories of being underestimated, overlooked, or treated differently because of factors beyond their control. And as they shared, something remarkable happened. They started to listen to one another. Truly listen. Angela's voice softened slightly, her tone more reflective. Listening doesn't solve everything. It doesn't erase history or undo harm. But it's a start. It creates the space for understanding. And from that understanding, the possibility of change. She stepped back slightly from the podium, her hands resting lightly on its edges. We often talk about justice as though it's confined to legal systems and courtroom decisions. But justice isn't just about laws. It's about the small, human moments that shape how we see and treat one another. It's about the ripples those moments create, spreading outward into our communities, our institutions, our world. Angela could feel the energy in the room shift, the weight of her words sinking in. People weren't just listening, they were reflecting. She could see it in their faces, the quiet stillness of deep thought. As we leave here today, she said, her voice steady again, I challenge each of us to think about the ripples we create. In our work, in our interactions, in the choices we make every day. Because those ripples matter. They shape the world in ways we can't always see but must never underestimate. She stepped back, her final words hanging in the air. The room erupted into applause, not the polite kind, but something deeper, more resonant. Angela nodded briefly in acknowledgement before stepping off the stage. As she walked toward the exit, she was stopped by a young attorney. Judge Carter, he said, his voice hesitant but determined. I just wanted to thank you. Your words today, they've made me think about how I approach jury selection. I've always thought I was fair, but now I see how I might need to dig deeper. Angela smiled faintly, her tone kind but firm. Awareness is the first step, she said. The rest is in the doing. Throughout the reception that followed, others approached her with similar sentiments, sharing stories, offering thanks, seeking guidance. Angela listened, responding thoughtfully but briefly. She wasn't seeking praise or validation. What mattered to her was the ripple effect, the possibility that these conversations might inspire action beyond the walls of the conference. Later, back in her hotel room, Angela opened her laptop. She drafted an email to Maya, recounting the events of the flight and the impact they had sparked. Change doesn't always happen in grand gestures, she wrote. Sometimes, it starts with a single conversation. The important thing is to keep those conversations going. As she hit send, Angela leaned back in her chair, gazing out the window at the city lights below. They flickered like stars, each one representing a life, a story, a ripple waiting to spread. Justice, she thought, was not just about making the right decisions from the bench. It was about creating the conditions for understanding in courtrooms, in airplanes, in every corner of life. And perhaps, just perhaps, those small moments of connection could one day grow into something larger. Something transformative. As Angela closed her laptop, a quiet sense of purpose settled over her. The work of justice was never finished. But it was in these moments, quiet, deliberate, human, that it truly began.